Good evening, everyone. Hi, Anthony. We're going to get started in a moment or two. We're just waiting for a few other confirmed guests to arrive. I was saying, Herb, I finally get to see what you look like. We communicate a lot on email, but I've never actually seen your face before.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, Mr. Ortona. How are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
Good. We're going to start in 1 minute precisely. I'm just waiting for a few other confirmed guests who are just beginning to arrive. Good evening, bonsoir. My name is Marvin Rotrand. I am the National Director for the
This meeting is being recorded.
I am the National Director for the League for Human Rights of Brith Canada. Mon nom est Marvin Rotrand. Je suis le Directeur National de la Ligue des droits de la personne de Brith Canada. Ces réunions déroulent en français et en anglais. Les gens peuvent choisir la langue de leur choix. This meeting will be in English and French. People can intervene in the language of their choice. Before I begin, I want to recognize some B'nai Brith partners who are here with us today. I want to note the presence not only of our Member of Parliament for Mount Royal, Anthony Housefather, who is our guest in this first of a series of town halls. I want to note the presence of Ramon Vicente, the president of Filipino Family Services, Irene Anthony, representing the Antigua and Barbuda Association, Cynthia Waite, Nigel Clark, representing Barbados House, Minda Mazzoni, representing the Federation of Filipino Canadian Associations of Quebec, Miss Yvonne Sam from the Black Community Resource Center. I want to note the presence of Rory Neeson, the Deputy Mayor of the City of Burlington, Ontario, Joe Ortona, the Chair of the English Montreal School Board. With us in the next few moments will be Mr. Bashir Hussain, the President of the Council of South Asian Communities of Canada. Ms. Lilia Esguerra, representing Amon Institute, and as others on our guest list arrive, I'll have announced them as well. This meeting initially was conceived as a Quebec-based town hall, with the audience largely drawn from West End Montreal, from the Mount Royal riding in particular, where B'nai Brith headquarters in Quebec is actually located, but has grown into one of national interest, which explains why Mr. Nissan and others are here this evening, particularly over issues dealing with the Official Language Act and Bill C-13. In fact, in the past number of days, B'nai Brith has had a lot of calls, partly generated by Mr. Housefather's opinion piece that appeared in National Post and which was widely discussed on the airwaves over the last couple of days. There is a real visceral fear about the erosion of minority language rights, not only in Quebec, but nationally. Francophones outside of Quebec, Anglophones inside of Quebec. B'nai Brith, as all of you on this call know, has taken a very strong position opposed to Bill 96, which we see as a law that doesn't enhance and promote French, but rather reduces access to English language services of many who live in English, are Anglophones in Quebec, but aren't necessarily recognized by the law as such. This has impacted the Jewish community as well. We've advocated to the government of Quebec, even for minor reforms. For example, we pointed out that the law as written would make it more difficult for Jewish congregations and seminaries to recruit rabbis and teachers from outside of the country. Previously, those receiving certificates were given a 3-year exemption, which was renewable and renewable. In the current iteration, they get 1 3-year exemption. The ability of institutions in the Jewish community to attract top talent from outside of the country is diminished when potential rabbis or teachers are told their children will not have the right to an English language Jewish school, and other obstacles which make us less competitive on the market. Unfortunately, the government has been flexible. We understand now that the debate around the changes to the Official Language Act, there are those in Parliament advocating that Bill 96 be given a certain primacy, and I'm sure that will come up this evening, and Mr. Housefather will address it. I also want to note on the call a former member of the Quebec National Assembly, Mr. Lawrence Bergman, who represented Darcy McGee, which was largely within the boundaries of the Mount Royal riding that Mr. Housefather currently represents in Parliament. I welcome everyone to this call. I mentioned this is the first in a series of town halls. B'nai Brith will endeavor to do something similar in each region of the country over the next year. Some of the town halls will be by Zoom, others will be in person, others will be hybrid. We'll go with the flow as things evolve, with the hope that we're able to have a dialogue between our members and our allies with members of Parliament, and that issues of importance can be ventilated in these meetings and brought back to the knowledge of the Parliament. The format for today will be simple. I'll give the floor in a few minutes to Mr. Housefather. He'll speak briefly, and then before we go to the question period, I'll go to Mr. Ortona. We had a lot of requests for people wanting a follow-up from our last 2 meetings in which we discussed Quebec Bill 40 and the legal challenge, and seemingly it's disappeared, and it's been an awfully long time, and we don't know what's happening. Perhaps Mr. Ortona will be able to inform us, and then we'll open the question period for the public. So I'll go without post haste to Mr. Housefather, who has the time that he requires, 10, 15 minutes, whatever he would like, to give us an overview of what he thinks are the major issues, what he's working on locally, provincially, federally, and what message he would like to leave to us. Anthony, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Marvin. I thought I was sticking to one issue, which is language, because that was what was in the invitation, and I don't think that 10 minutes is even enough to deal with language, let alone to talk about my activities right now, calling Google Canada and Google to the committee to deal with the fact that they're shutting off their search engine to Canadian news content and trying to threaten Canadians that Bill C-18 shouldn't go through, or what I'm doing with Canada Soccer that is calling the women's team in Canada Soccer to committee. So I think let's stick to language for the beginning, and I'm happy to answer questions on any issue you want. And it's so nice to see Rory there, and it's so nice to see Joe Ortona there, and Lawrence, and it's great to have other elected officials that took the time. I know how busy everybody is to listen. Look, the language issue is a real problem. English-speaking Quebecers don't have allies right now. We are very much alone in this fight. Quebec's Law 96 is not the right balance. Quebec's Law 96 looks at a real problem. How do you protect and promote French in Canada? French is a minority language in the world. It's constantly under attack from international forces, such as social media, that's all in English. It's under attack from the fact that most immigrants that come to Canada outside of Quebec acculturate into the English-speaking community. And in Quebec, there's a competition between French and English, although there have never been more immigrants that have acculturated into the French community in Quebec than there are today, and mixed it up with the question of the English-speaking minority in Quebec. And Bill 96 does a lot of things. Marvin brought up a couple, but let me talk about some of the things that I find egregious about Law 96. Law 96 says to English-speaking Quebecers, all English-speaking Quebecers, that you can't get birth certificates, marriage certificates, or death certificates in English anymore, even though we've been able to do that since Confederation. That you can't file an English contract to sell your house at the land registry without a certified legal translation into French. All of these things were things we always were able to do, and to be honest, could be done with a press of a button. To get a birth certificate in English in Quebec, all the bureaucrat needs to do is press a button for the English version, and you would get your birth certificate in English or your death certificate in English. But you're not allowed to do that anymore. That doesn't in any way add rights to the French-speaking majority. It doesn't give one additional services to French-speaking Quebecers. It just takes away services from English speakers. And as Lauren said about a previous bill, it's just mean-spirited. There's nothing else other than that. Then they have taken away rights from a significant percentage of English-speaking Quebecers. At the federal level, we look at an English-speaking Quebecer as someone who says their first official language is English rather than French. That in Quebec is 1.2 million people. That's versus the number of people who speak English at home, which is about 900,000, and the number of people that speak English as their mother tongue, which is about 800,000. But still the most significant minority language population in the country. There are as many English-speaking Quebecers in Quebec as there are French-speaking Canadians outside of Quebec. But the bill, when it's counting who's an English speaker, uses none of these factors. It says that English-speaking Quebecers are those who have the right to attend English schools in Quebec. The only people who have the right to attend English schools in Quebec are those who had parents or grandparents who were educated by the majority of their primary education in Canada. And there's some other little rules, like it could be a sibling, but I mean, today, there's no sibling that gets in, if you can't get in any case, it's smaller than the number of English speakers counted by either home language, mother tongue, or first official language spoken. There are many French speakers that have the right to attend English schools, and there's a significant number of English speakers, including many whose English mother tongue cannot go to English schools, and those people will no longer have the right to receive government services in Quebec in English, subject to some exceptions, such as healthcare, where there is an exception, but it's not in a clear exception as the government makes it out to be. Then when you do talk about bilingual institutions, such as healthcare institutions, where you are supposed to continue to retain the right to have services in English for everyone, those institutions can no longer require employees to have knowledge of English when they hire them in the majority of cases. The new law makes it very difficult for even an English-speaking hospital like the Jewish General Hospital to require a new nurse or orderly or doctor being hired to have knowledge of English. So even though people will still theoretically be entitled to health and social services in English, even if you are not entitled to send your kids to English schools, you may well have bilingual institutions in 10, 20 years that don't have enough people that can serve you in English. And I can go on and on about this bill, the fact that it uses the notwithstanding clause preemptively in an omnibus way, which is never the way the notwithstanding clause was meant to be used, the fact that it buries the Quebec Charter of Rights and makes it subservient to the Charter of the French language, so nobody can ever claim that their rights under the Quebec Charter of Rights are being violated anymore based on language issues in Quebec. The fact that the bill violates Section 133 of the Constitution Act because it no longer has the courts having equal status of English and French. If you are a corporation and you want to file something in court, any kind of pleading, you need a certified French translation. So it discourages corporations and nonprofits from filing in English. And then the Quebec minister will decide whether judges need to be bilingual as opposed to the Chief Justice. So you may have times where it will lag and you'll have a much longer time to be tried in English versus in French. All of these things are of concern, of great concern, which is why me and many other Liberal MPs from the Montreal area opposed Bill 96. And I fought very hard in our caucus for our party to take a position against Bill 96, which the Minister Lametti did the day Bill 96 was adopted. And we, at that point, clarified very clearly that we will oppose the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause before the Supreme Court when either the Bill 21 case gets there or if we do a reference. I'm not sure how we're going to do it, but we will say that the notwithstanding clause cannot be used preemptively. This would be to reverse a Supreme Court precedent from the 1980s. So we need to make sure we have the best possible case to do it. I personally think the Bill 21 case is the best case to do it because you have plaintiffs who have actually been harmed and the judges can see an actual harm that has been done. But that's on the table. But that leads us to Federal Bill 96. federal bill, sorry, C-13, which has led to myself and some of my colleagues, Patricia Latanzio, Emmanuel Lambropoulos, and Mark Garneau, going to the official languages committee in which we do not sit, proposing amendments to the bill, and being there to oppose conservative and block amendments to the bill. So let's start by the premise that C-13 has a few flaws that English-speaking organizations in Quebec have said need to be addressed, and I agree, which is why, from the time the bill was deposited, starting in the spring of last year, I have told my party, I have told the Prime Minister's office, I have told the Quebec caucus that Patricia and I have amendments to this bill, and copies of those amendments were provided to everyone. We didn't surprise anyone by going to the committee and proposing amendments. The amendments are in two areas. In the Liberal version of the bill, C-13, the bill remained with the standard Official Language Act view of English-speaking minorities in Quebec and French-speaking minorities outside Quebec. The bill essentially was based on substantive equality, where legally the French-speaking community outside Quebec and the English-speaking community in Quebec would be treated equally. That is the general rule of the bill. However, there were two references in the Official Languages Act proposed. So Bill C-13 amends the Official Languages Act that was last amended 30 years ago. It was a demand of both minority language communities for many years to give more powers to the Commissioner of Official Languages, to give more teeth to the act, to the requirement of the government to support the two communities. Those are all good things. But there were a couple of bad things. There were two places in the bill, one in the preamble and one in a section where we talk about delegating powers to the provinces and what happens when you reach administrative agreements with the province, where we reference Quebec's Charter of the French Language, which is today Law 96. It basically said the following: Quebec's Charter of the French Language has declared that French is the official language of Quebec. That's all that it said. It didn't substantively incorporate Law 96 in any way, but it made reference to it. I see two problems with that substantively. One are that why would we reference a bill that is indeed supported by the majority of French-speaking Quebecers, but is supported by less than 5% of English-speaking Quebecers? A tiny, tiny minority of the minority language community you're trying to protect under the Official Languages Act supports it. The vast majority, indeed almost the totality of the minority language community that you're trying to support under the Official Languages Act doesn't agree with this bill. Why would you mention it? Could you imagine if in Ontario passed an act that banned French from many government services, and then you would say, let's incorporate that in the Official Languages Act? It would be a laugh. Nobody would ever do it. Nobody would ever propose it. So why would we be doing it in the case of Quebec? Secondly, we've already said in our government, our Attorney General, David Lametti, will be opposing the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause before the Supreme Court. Why would we then positively reference a bill that actually uses the notwithstanding clause preemptively? I can just wait to see the Attorney General of Quebec stand up, or the Attorney General of Ontario, who will no doubt join Quebec in saying that the notwithstanding clause can be used preemptively, and other provinces saying, but Mr. Attorney General, in your very own bill adopted by Parliament, you referenced a bill that used the notwithstanding clause preemptively and spoke of it in positive terms. That is ridiculous. Finally, I am concerned that based on the reference related to the transfer of powers to the provinces, that there will be an argument when Quebec has powers that are administratively transferred to Quebec that would otherwise be federal powers that require both official languages being used, that Quebec will argue that based on the reference in the bill, they only need to serve people in English if they have access to English schools. So those were my main arguments to the initial bill. And indeed, my colleague Patricia Latanzio and many members of the English-speaking Quebec caucus from the Liberals have vocally supported the amendments that Patricia and I are proposing. The first one was already heard by the committee. It was to remove the reference to the Quebec Charter of the French Language, Bill 90, which is now Law 96, from the bill. All the Liberals at committee voted yes, because we got our party to support removing the references that we put in there originally, but they recognized that because of Law 96, the circumstances changed. All the Liberals at the committee voted in favor of our amendment, but it was opposed by the Bloc, the Conservatives, and the NDP. So the references to Law 96 stay in the bill at this point. But what is much, much worse, and this I need people to understand, is the Bloc and the Conservatives. The Bloc and the Conservatives have proposed over 100 amendments that would integrate Law 96 into the Act. There are 27 Conservative and Bloc amendments that specifically refer to Law 96 and attempt to make the federal law what Law 96 is. Again, this is the Conservative Party of Canada doing this, whose position is essentially the same as the Bloc Québécois on this issue. Obviously, an attempt to court nationalist votes in Quebec. And it's awful. And so some of the amendments, for example, would say that the federal government recognizes that the Charter of the French language promotes French properly in Quebec, and would essentially say, don't do court challenges against Law 96, including the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause, which I will remind everybody the Conservative Party joined the Bloc in saying that it's up to the provinces whether they want to use the notwithstanding clause at any time, including preemptively. But they also seek to say that the proper way to promote French is based on Quebec's language regime, which includes Bill Law 96. So what they're saying in these amendments is the federal bill should follow Law 96 and how you give services in English and French in Quebec. The problem with that, of course, is, number one, let's all be clear, this adds no services to French-speaking people outside Quebec, because Law 96 definitely doesn't do that. It doesn't add any federal services in English in Quebec, in French in Quebec, because all federal services are offered in French in Quebec. What it does do is it changes English services in Quebec, as the bureaucrats who have been before the committee, the civil servants, have clearly stated. All services in Quebec are given in French. We give services in English and French across Canada on exactly the same terms, based on whether or not there's enough English people in Quebec in a certain area to justify services in English, or whether or not there's enough French-speaking people outside Quebec to justify services in French. Now, based on the bill, as the civil servant stated, they would need to look based on the Conservatives and Bloc amendments that are being proposed, some of which have been adopted already at the committee, because the NDP voted with the Conservatives and the Bloc on some, but not most of their amendments, but some of them. The bureaucrats said, well, this will lead us to have to look at what offices will require English. Will we reduce the number of offices that are serving in English? Will we reduce the number of hours where people can be served in English? Or will we make signs in Quebec have to be 3 times the French over the English, instead of bilingual as they are in all of Canada? This is what was said by civil servants at committee in response to my questions, not by me. And these amendments are definitely incredibly problematic, incredibly dangerous. And unfortunately, because of the way that everybody heard about the initial bill, but hasn't understood how the bill is being changed at the committee, people are unaware of what the Bloc and the Conservatives have been doing at the committee that has amended the bill, and it's changed it from a bill that generally was substantive equality with some exceptions to a bill that is now asymmetrical, meaning that the rights of French speakers outside Quebec are not the same anymore as the rights of English speakers in Quebec. And so with the bill as is, and there's going to be many more changes because there's still another 100 amendments from the Bloc and the Conservatives that haven't been heard yet, including one or many that would say that federally regulated private businesses in Quebec would not be governed under a special federal regime that we're proposing, but rather would be governed by Bill 101 itself. That it looks like the NDP are in support of as well, and that is likely to pass in the coming weeks. Remember that over the last few years, again, most English-speaking Quebecers are unaware of this, and most English speakers outside of Quebec don't have any clue. The Conservatives in the Bloc and the NDP have all voted on multiple occasions in the House of Commons to require federally regulated private businesses in Quebec to be subject to the Charter of the French language, which is now Law 96. Only the Liberals have voted against it. And so for English-speaking Quebecers, you need to be aware, you may be mildly dissatisfied with the Liberal Party position. You will be 500 times more dissatisfied with the other party's position on this issue, and it's about to come to a head because this bill will eventually get out of committee and come back to the House of Commons. And I don't know what will happen. Will we be able to somehow amend it in the House of Commons to reverse all these amendments from the Bloc and the Conservatives and to get rid of the references to the Charter of French language? Maybe, but it would require one of the other parties supporting us. The only possibility is the NDP or the Greens, but the Greens don't have enough votes. And will the NDP reverse what Nikki Ashton did at the committee? I don't know. I doubt it. Possible. But in the end, I may well be left with a bill that I cannot possibly vote for. And some of my colleagues feel the same way. And it's a real problem for the future of our community, I think, that we've gotten to this point where, you know, our voices are not being heard. And it's really problematic. And I think that took way more time than Marvin allotted me, but I think language and this issue is important enough for everybody to properly understand. Happy to take your questions, though, on that or anything else you want to ask me about. Thanks, Marvin.
Thank you, Anthony. And my apologies for having said 10, 15 minutes. I really meant to say you need to take the time you need to take the time. And your presentation is rather chilling. I've heard the same because clearly the Jewish community in Quebec is diverse, but it's largely and historically Anglophone. And a lot of people have read the same things in the papers. You have to understand, for the bulk of the population, the day-to-day at committees in Parliament is somewhat obscure and difficult to discern. And, you know, often there are explanations that don't seem to make sense. But, you know, clearly there has been a majority on the committee that have seemed to want to give primacy to Bill 96 and change the entire direction of the history of the official language.
The primacy. So let me just clarify, because I want to make clear, one of my colleagues got this wrong, and I want to make this clear. There were indeed some block amendments that said, in the event of a conflict between the Official Languages Act and Law 96 would take precedence. Those were ruled out of order by the chairman of the committee. They were not even debated, let alone voted on. The amendments that have been adopted, though, would require anybody making decisions under the federal act to take into consideration Quebec's language regime, including Law 96. So as opposed to just mentioning that it exists in the original bill, it would actually integrate it into the bill in a way that you would have to look and approvingly look at Quebec's language regime as the proper way to promote French. And that will create disadvantages, but it doesn't create the idea that one takes precedence over the other. And just because somebody else got that wrong and the press jumped on them, I want to make sure that everybody understands that. Thanks, Marvin.
Okay, that's a good clarification. But before I go to Joe Ortona on Bill 40, can you explain the next steps? What is the time frame for the committee's work? Once it's done, what's the process for tabling it in Parliament? When does it come up for debate, and when does it come up for a vote?
So unknown, the committee has it in its possession in the normal ways that committees would have to debate sequentially every amendment before them. Every amendment could go on forever if people wanted to talk about it, but normally when the speaking list expires, it goes to a vote. And the committee has been generally getting through 5 or 6 amendments per 2-hour meeting. And there's another 100 and some odd left. However, there's an agreement originally from that committee that they would do 8 meetings and they would vote sequentially on all the rest of the amendments without debate. So it's possible, if the committee doesn't change that perspective, they will only have a couple more meetings and they'll go to sequential votes and it will be back to the House in a couple of weeks. Otherwise, it could take a lot longer at committee if they decide to keep debating the amendments. Then my understanding is it would be up to the House leader as to when to bring that bill back. But the opposition parties could force it back by putting forward an opposition day motion to require the bill to return to the House. So anybody who believes that the prime minister, or even the House leader or anybody has the ability to stop the bill coming back forever, unilaterally, that's not the case. But there is, and then there would be debates in the House. I'm sure many people would want to debate this, and you could make amendments at report stage in the House to try to reverse the amendments made at committee, or to take some of them back and change the bill. But again, you'd need a dancing partner And that's unknown to me at this time. But of course, that would be what I would push for as my preferred option, that we try to amend the bill at committee, at report stage in the House, to reverse all the bad amendments at committee and to incorporate those amendments that I was bringing forward that have failed at committee.
Well, having been a former politician, that exact strategy did work at City Council a couple of times when a committee came back with a report that was generally seen by the public and majority members of council as flawed. And essentially, that was stripped out of the committee report, and some of the amendments that didn't go forward became new amendments on the floor of council during the debate. We were integrated into the final bill. Just one more question of clarification. Let's say this works out as what you see as a worst case scenario, and what is adopted by a majority vote in the House of Commons is largely a bill which has most of these amendments integrated. It then goes to the Senate. What is the Senate's exact role? And what if what comes out of the Senate is not the same bill that went into the Senate? What's the next stage after that?
Yeah, so that would be a horrible scenario, because it meant that a majority of the House of Commons adopted a bill that was not good for the English-speaking minority in Quebec. And I would be very disappointed, although it's very clear. Like, first of all, it may be that the Conservatives and Bloc originally were against the bill because it didn't go far enough to accommodate Quebec's demands, right? Now, if they reverse it to do enough that they vote for it because it now accommodates Quebec's demands, what does that do to the original Liberal support for the bill? Like, again, I don't know how this will play out, but if it goes to the Senate, then the Senate is an co-equal chamber, and they're able to make amendments to the bill that they get. It goes before a Senate committee. The Senate can make amendments, and then the House would need to either accept or reject the Senate amendments. But I have been talking to my colleagues in the Senate, like Judith Seidman, who is willing to, work on this if a bad version of the bill goes, or Tony Lafredo. But I don't know how much the Senate is going to do here either. The same forces that you have now in the House exist as well in the Senate. So we will have to see, and we'll try our best to get it amended in the Senate if it goes badly through the House. But right now we're trying our best to, stop the bad things from going in as best as we can and fight for things to get better.
Well, I can say that your presentation this evening is widely shared in our community, the Jewish community, among Anglophones and minorities in Quebec. You mentioned a figure of the Bill 96 has very negligible support in these communities. I can attest to that simply by the outreach from partner organizations, not just Jewish community, but visible minorities, Anglophones, even people who say, well, even under Bill 96, I'm recognized as a minority, but my partner isn't, or my grandchildren aren't. There's always something there that, strips away a right that's always existed for since the country was founded, and in no way stripping it away aids the promotion of French and protects the French language. People see it as purely punitive. One last clarification, I'm sorry. If the Senate bill is substantially different, in the United States, there's a House-Senate committee to harmonize different versions of a bill that have been adopted. Does that exist in Canada? If not, does the process of a bill coming back that's substantially different from the Senate require a long study in the House?
So in the US, you would normally go through reconciliation, but you would only do it in certain bills. In Canada, you could have that process, but the House may just consider the amendments without going through that process. It really depends. It's rare we would use it, but it sometimes happens.
All right. Thank you, Anthony, for those clarifications. I'm going to ask Joe Ortona. You spoke at one of our past meetings on Bill 40. I mean, there was a movement of the Anglophone community in Quebec to protect its institutions, including its school boards, when this bill was adopted. There was wide support for the English Montreal School Board and other school boards' challenge of Bill 40. And what we understand is the constitutional arguments were extremely strong and were upheld by the court. The government of Quebec appealed, and forgive me, but it's getting to be hazy in my memory because it's so long ago. We haven't heard of a judgment. Perhaps you know something that we don't know, but at least once a week, I get a call of somebody asking me about Bill 40. Would you clarify where we are? And while you're doing that, not everyone on the call will be familiar with the bill. Could you give a little resume of the situation?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be here, and answer any questions and give anybody information about any of our court challenges at the English Montreal School Board. So the English Montreal School Board currently has 3 court challenges to legislation that is before the courts. One is on Bill 40, and I'm going to get to that very shortly. Bill 21 was the second one, the religious symbols ban, which was heard by the Court of Appeal last November. And we're expecting a decision probably within the next 1 or 2 months, April, May. And Bill 96, of course, which we launched last June, and that's still at the very early stages, so that hasn't been heard yet in the Superior Court. Bill 40, right after it was adopted, that was the bill that abolishes school boards, transforms them all into service centers, removes the method in which the community elects their school commissioners and has elected representation on the council, centralizes many of the powers that are currently within the hands of school boards to the Ministry of Education. Excuse me. And of course, we challenged Bill 40 from the very beginning on the grounds that it violates Section 23 and our right to, which is Section 23 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is our ability to manage and control our school system. What we did at the very first stage was we fought to get an injunction, and that means the official legal term is actually a stay. So a stay on the application of the law for English language school boards in Quebec. That injunction was granted, and that was way back in 2020. The government had appealed that decision, and that decision was also upheld by the Court of Appeal of Quebec. It was then heard on the actual merits. So the injunction is in place until the hearing is held on the merits of the constitutional challenge and until the decision is rendered. So the case was heard in April of 2021. Written submissions were given in June of 2021. And so Mr. Rotrand is right. It has been a while since we've had news because we still do not have a decision from Superior Court on the constitutionality of Bill 40. That decision is pending. It will be 2 years now in June that we haven't gotten a decision. It is, as far as I know, and as far as any other lawyers I've spoken to, unprecedented that it's taking this long. Our best guess is that the judge is going clause by clause. Every section of the bill that we are fighting on Section 23 grounds and doing an analysis as to whether that specific section of the law is violates Section 23 or not. That's all I can tell you right now. Anything else with regards to Bill 40 is really speculation. Of course, we're confident that we're going to get a favorable decision. It's the reason why we launched the court challenge to begin with. But it's been very long, and we're anxiously waiting and patiently waiting, if that's possible, to be doing both at the same time. But we're waiting for a decision, and I would always be happy to let Marvin and the others know once we get that. As I said, we're confident that it's going to be in our favor. We're just going to have to be patient for a little while longer and wait and see.
Thank you for that, Joe. To clarify, the status of the board remains you are completely valid and legal. Given the original judgment, you've won your case on Bill 40. The government cannot strip away your powers. They cannot impose the structure of a service center during the period that we're waiting for a judgment. And so it'll come eventually. As you say, the time frame seems rather unprecedented and very, very long, and that always causes anxiety to members of the community who would like to see the Anglophone community control its own institutions and own school boards. In the event that the appeal is a mixed bag, is there a plan to appeal beyond there if some of your powers are in effect stripped away by the judgment, or is it premature for me to ask you that question?
We're going to have to wait and see what the judgment is and what it says, and we're going to have to take a look at that. Look, there's one silver lining to the fact that it is taking this long, is that we continue to operate with our full powers and rights as a school board. It has allowed us to purchase air purifiers in all of our classrooms, something that none of the service centers were able to do. When we will get a decision, our lawyers will obviously be taking a look at that. And if there are any rights that are taken away, of course, we're going to have to take a very serious look at that and analyze that and see, based on the judge's reasoning, if it is worth appealing. But certainly, those options are open. What I'm hoping for is a decision that the government is going to want to look at and analyze, and that they can decide whether they want to appeal or not. That's what we're hoping for.
Thank you very much, Joe. We'll go now to
Thank you.
The question period. I'm going to start the first question from someone who is actually not here, who contacted me several times. That's Bashir Hussain from the South Asian, the Council of South Asian Communities, who represent people in Quebec and in Ontario who are of origin in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, and who have told us repeatedly that many of their members have been impacted by various laws adopted in Quebec, particularly Bill 21. As well, they fear that many of their members will lose rights to English language services in Quebec because they don't qualify under Bill 101 and they don't qualify under Bill 96. Mr. Hussain's question was, he wanted comments from Mr. Housefather on the abusive use of the notwithstanding clause, which seems to allow the government of Quebec to override the Quebec Charter of Rights, and almost now seems to use it in a preemptive fashion. He wanted to know what were the powers of the government of Canada to refer this to the courts, and why hasn't it happened already, given Mr. Lamedi's statement a few months ago?
Sure. So the first thing is there's confusion there because, of course, the notwithstanding clause we're now talking about is in the federal charter, not the Quebec charter. Quebec's charter does have a notwithstanding clause, but the Quebec charter, based on the recent Law 96, is now subservient to Law 96. So you can't challenge the Charter of the French language under the Quebec Charter of Rights, which is one of the unconscionable parts of the bill that nobody pays real attention to. Under the federal charter, the federal government has two options in terms of challenging the preemptive use. So number one, I'm opposed to the notwithstanding clause, don't think it should be in the charter. It's there as a result of a compromise that existed in 1982, but I don't think it should ever be used. I will never vote federally to use the notwithstanding clause, and the federal parliament has never voted a law that uses the notwithstanding clause ever. The issue of whether provinces have a right to use it, provinces certainly have a right to use it after a court judgment that goes against them, after prolonged public debate and public awareness that a court has ruled that a right has been violated in a way that is not legitimate in a free and democratic society under Section 1 of the Charter. And the normal way this has been done is you use a notwithstanding clause after the Supreme Court renders judgments, and you do so accepting the risk of your population, knowing that you chose to ignore a court judgment. What Quebec is doing in Bill 21 and Bill 96, and what Ontario has also tried to do with respect to the recent labor dispute, is use the clause preemptively, saying, that we're not saying that a right has been violated, we're just using it. And so they blind their population to the fact that rights are violated. And so that's a significant problem. And as I push very hard, Minister Lamedi has clarified that he will indeed intervene at the Supreme Court level to argue that the notwithstanding clause cannot be used preemptively, as Quebec has used it and Ontario has attempted to use it. And as I explained as well, there's two ways for us to do that. One of them is you can do a reference case. A reference case would basically say, you're asking the court a question. You have no plaintiff. You have no significant issue that you're raising before the court. You're asking them a legal question. And without a sympathetic plaintiff, without a story to tell, without a record at the court, at the superior court, and a judgment at the Court of Appeal, you run the risk that the Supreme Court will legally answer what it did in the 1980s, that yes, you could use the clause preemptively. So the federal government has always been able to reference this case to the Supreme Court, reference the question, and it would be asking a legal question to the court. I don't oppose it, but I don't know that that's the best route. The best route, I believe, is using the Bill 21 case that is already waiting for judgment at the Quebec Court of Appeal, where there's an excellent factual record from the Superior Court judge. And the Court of Appeal, anyway, no matter how they rule, it will be appealed to the Supreme Court. And that way, the federal government can argue the notwithstanding clause cannot be used preemptively as it was in Bill 21 and show the court the people that were harmed, the teachers that wear the hijab, potential police officers that wear a turban, prosecutors that wear a kippah. And the court will have no choice if it rules in favor of Quebec, but to turn a blind eye to all those victims of Bill 21. So that is why I believe the Attorney General has not done something yet. He's waiting for the Bill 21 case to get to the Supreme Court, which is where we will intervene. But it's possible he may do an intervention through instead of waiting for an intervention, he may do a reference. I don't have control over his activities, and that would be fine too. It's just I don't know that that's the best way to bring it before the Supreme Court. Anyways, thanks very much.
I will communicate your response to Mr. Hussein. I think he was open on the question. He was just seeking a clarification because he knew that was an option, and he was curious why it hadn't been followed up on. But I think your answer speaks for itself. Before I go to the other questions, I want to note the presence of a number of individuals, including Errol Johnson, City Councillor for Dollar des Ormeaux, Ellie Israel, School Commissioner for the English Montreal School Board. I see Madame Nicole Swan of Ghanaian Nationals Association has joined us, and I'll be noting others as they come on. Before the meeting, a number of individuals contacted us to signal that they wanted to ask a question, and I'm going to go in chronological order to them. The first person is Mr. Ramon Vicente, the President of Filipino Family Services. Mr. Vicente, the floor is yours to ask your question.
Thank you, Marvin. Good evening, Mr. Housefather, and good evening to one and all. May is Jewish Heritage Month, and June is Filipino Heritage Month. Permit me to recognize your role in having Parliament adopt motions that created these important months that celebrate our diversity, our common Canadian values, and our distinct identities. I am proud Filipino Canadian, and I am honored to work with Jewish Canadians. We should all be proud that Canada allows us to cherish our origins while bringing us together to support shared values. Given the importance these months have in promoting diversity and combating hate and intolerance, they, like other heritage months that celebrate other ethnicities contributing to Canada's success, do not receive much in a way of funding from either the federal or provincial governments. Can you help address this issue, Mr. Housefather? It would seem natural to Heritage Canada to fund grants that would allow the heritage months to grow and prosper. If programs are available, they are not known and should be better publicized. Allow me to thank you in advance for any help that you can give in this regard.
So thank you, Ramon. I mean, you know quite well to go to my office and ask what grants are available for anything, and you are welcome to contact Chelsea in my office and find out exactly what grants are available. There are grants that are available for communities for Heritage Months. They're not significant, but they are there. And again, happy to happy to work with you. I'm just in the same way we just got the grants for FAMAS for the seniors program. Oh my goodness. My gosh, what's it called?
New Horizons.
New Horizons, that's right. We're happy to help, on this, but again, the grants are limited, and and that's based on what monies are available in that ministry that deals with heritage. But again, happy to help with any request that you make. If you have a proposal for June, just come to us with it, and we'll look what grants we can help you get.
Thank you, Anthony. Ramon, I'm interested in your question. Indeed, May is Jewish Heritage Month, and last year B'nai Brith launched the first concerted national effort to celebrate that month. It had never been in any systematic way celebrated before. I'm very proud of the fact that 42 cities and towns across Canada adopted proclamations, and there were a couple of ceremonies. June is Filipino Heritage Month, and it's been celebrated with a great deal of vigor by the community from coast to coast over the last number of years. I want to let the audience know I was recently in Manila in the Philippines, and I met with the Foreign Affairs Department, and we came to an agreement to try to promote a joint activity to note the historic friendship of Filipinos and Jews, and to, in particular, note that while most of the world closed its doors to Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust, the Philippines did what it could. That President Quezon wanted to accept as many as he could. The Philippines was not completely independent. The Americans only allowed him to take in about 1,500 people, but he saved 1,500 lives. That's a story that needs to be told. It's not well enough known. And we agreed to do some sort of Zoom event that will be global, with the idea of promoting that. Perhaps we can work together to integrate that. Perhaps that'll be something that might be eligible for some funding. I don't know, but I'm glad you asked the question. I think it's a very, very valid question. Anthony's offered his help, so we'll leverage Chelsea, who is on this call as well, to see what we can do to find funding. Our second question will be from Ellie Israel, School Commissioner, Ward number 1 of the English Montreal School Board. Commissioner Israel, the floor is yours.
I have unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you very much. You can go ahead now.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Rotrand, and good evening, Mr. Housefather. Many people saw your recent opinion piece in the National Post, and it had great resonance with minority language communities, not only in Quebec, but nationally. Bill 96's goal seems not to promote French, but to reduce access to English language services to a large part of Quebec's English-speaking community. One only needs to think of native English speakers, such as the Jewish Orthodox immigrants from the United States, or most people from the Caribbean community, or many in the Filipino community who did not go to school in Quebec, but are Anglophone. We have to understand that they will be severely inconvenienced with no discernible gain in protecting French. Mr. Housefather, can you advise us if the effort to amend Bill C-13, which updates the Official Languages Act, so that Bill 96 would apply and has a realistic chance of becoming law, that would enshrine discrimination and, in essence, allow the notwithstanding clause to gut the Constitution of Canada? I thank you, Mr. Housefather, for explaining this complex debate that is going on in Parliament, where the Bloc Québécois and the Conservative parties are proposing that Bill 96 have primacy. Thank you.
So thank you, Ellie. You can call me Anthony, and you know Marvin for so many years. We're an informal group here. I think we can all call each other by first names. As I mentioned, because I think I've answered really these questions in terms of the status. the primacy question is not primacy. Those amendments from the bloc were not allowed. The chairman ruled them out of order. The issue is the bloc and conservative amendments make the federal law have to consider Quebec's language policies, including Law 96, in regard to federal services in English in Quebec. And that's the real problem. Several of them have been adopted. Most of them have not, but several have. And they changed the tenor of the bill. And it's very unfortunate. And again, when you say that I hope my column had resonance across the country, I have to say so far, the English-speaking people outside Quebec seem very disengaged from this question. And French-speaking people outside Quebec are very much preoccupied with their own issues and their issues. They're very much in favor of the bill and they want it to pass. And because there are significant improvements in certain areas and they don't have the detriment of the mention of the Charter of the French language, etc. So the big problem we have is French-speaking people outside Quebec and those organizations want the bill to pass as quickly as possible. And they're willing to overlook these issues, which are very troubling to English-speaking Quebecers. And we're very much left on our own sometimes to fight. And as you saw by the treatment that myself and Mark Arnault and Emmanuel Lambropoulos have gotten in the French press, we've been attacked and vilified in the French press because we dare to speak out against Law 96 and against incorporating that federally. And so it's been a challenge. So I wish I could be more optimistic. I don't know where this is going to go.
Okay, thank you, Anthony.
Thanks, Ellie.
Thank you, Commissioner.
By the way, Marvin, I see Rory has his hand up, so I just want to make sure you see that.
Yeah, actually, he's next on the speakers list. I'm going to go to Deputy Mayor Rory Nissan. I've always called you Councillor Nissan, but I really got a promotion after the October election in Burlington. Can I call you Rory? Since we're being informal tonight, it's you to take the floor. Rory, go ahead.
Thanks, Marvin. Yes, of course you can. Our mayor, in her infinite wisdom of lifting up her colleagues, named us all deputy mayor, all 6 of us. And so my portfolio is actually the environment portfolio. It's a bit of a kitchen cabinet, but I thank you for noting that. And I want to thank you, Marvin, for booking this town hall and opening it up across the country, because it's been quite enlightening for me, someone who likes to think they're following what's going on federally. I'm on the Federation of Canadian Municipalities board and currently a vice president, but this hasn't come forward, and I'm going to bring this forward to FCM at the first opportunity, because I'm appalled at how this is going right now federally. The hijinks and the hijacking, I would say, of the bill. And I lived in Chelsea, Quebec for a while. I have friends up Highway 5 up in Kazabazois and Low Quebec, largely Anglophone communities who will be severely impacted, and I'm sure that's starting already with the Quebec law, because they're just not. Montreal is one thing for sure, hard enough, but there aren't a lot of services there. Period. So to try to then access services in a language you don't speak, they will become second class. So this is totally unacceptable. Anyway, Anthony, thank you very much for this very enlightening discussion. It appears to me that this is the NDP is behind is the crux of this at this point, the swing vote, so to speak, and Mr. Singh has probably some answering to do about the NDP's position, as he has on other issues affecting multiculturalism in the country. So. How can we remind him, how can we encourage him to take a principled stand for frankly all multicultural communities, including and also English minority speakers in Quebec?
It's a great question, Rory. Thank you so much. Obviously not my party. The issue here is, right, Nikki Ashton is the NDP MP on the committee. Whether she reflects the position of the overall party, I would say most NDP MPs, since they don't have any English-speaking MPs from Quebec, they only have Alexandre Boulris, are not aware of these issues, are not engaged in them. And I doubt that they would be supportive of the Charter of the French language being referenced in the bill. But I believe that they're giving fairly carte blanche to their member of the committee who has her own opinions and her own, priorities. And to be honest, I've tried to speak to some of my NDP colleagues, my friends, Alistair McGregor, and Peter Julian, and Gord Johns about it. And they're sort of, wow, okay, but Nikki's at the committee. I think the more people across Canada that would contact their own MPs and say they care about this in the other parties, I'm sure most conservative English-speaking MPs are very disengaged from this as well. They're just letting their Quebec caucus and the leader's office run their policy on this. And in fact, what's been interesting with the Conservatives, right, is the Conservatives originally had Brad Viss and Mark Dalton on the committee. Brad Viss and Mark Dalton at the very first meeting seemed to have realized that their party's position was one that they didn't agree with at all and started abstaining on the votes. And they were removed from the committee at the next meeting, and they brought in Marilyn Gladue. Marilyn Gladue, same thing. Halfway through the meeting, she started realizing she didn't agree with her own party's position at all, started voting against her party, and she was removed at the next meeting. And they put on 4 Quebec MPs who are all francophone from Quebec to represent them at this committee. The more, if Canadians across Canada outside of Quebec were actually interested in the issue, which most English Canadians unfortunately are not, they're disengaged from it because the Official Languages Act isn't really that important to them. They live in an English-speaking majority world and, don't really, worry about being a minority. Then I think things would change, right? If an MP got 300, if Lindsay Matheson got 300 emails from constituents in Hamilton saying they were very unhappy with the position the NDP was taking at the committee, things would change. If Melissa Lanceman in Thornhill got 1,000 emails from constituents in Thornhill saying they were unhappy with this, things might change. But so far that hasn't happened. Most of these MPs are not getting any emails at all or phone calls from their own residents in their own ridings saying they care about this. And that's the real issue.
Thank you.
If there's one person who can mobilize the community, that would be Marvin Rotrand. So I know Marvin's ready to go. Thank you so much, Marvin and Anthony. Thank you.
Thanks, Rory.
Thank you, Rory. Anthony, I think you have an offer there from Rory, who ultimately would be president of the FCM if he's vice president. If the procedure hasn't changed since my day, every year you move up a step. FCM certainly could be at least a podium to get the message out, if not an ally. But it's worth your while to talk to them. I have 2 other people on the list before we go to sort of general questions for a few minutes. The next speaker will be Minda Mazzoni, the president of the Federation of Filipino Canadian Associations of Quebec. Minda, the floor is yours.
Minda, you're on mute.
Hi, Anthony. Thanks, Marvin. Hello, everybody. Good evening. The Federation of Filipino Canadian Associations of Quebec, we denounce racism and hate wherever we see it, especially that we belong to the minority, English minority of Quebec. So every day we are confronted with these things. How we have adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and work closely with Jewish and Muslim groups to counter the targeting of their communities, including ours. We enjoy their support in combating anti-Asian racism. Recently, Christian Anderson, a German politician from the far-right Alternative for Germany party, visited Canada and was greeted by 3 MPs. Leslie Lewis, Colin Curry, and Dean Allison, whose smiling photos with her were worth more than 1,000 words. Anderson is well known for blatant Islamophobia, and her party shelters Holocaust deniers. No elected members should ever have met her. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre stated his caucus members did not know much about her background, other than she is an anti-vaxxer. I'm sorry, that does ring hollow. Can the House of Commons adopt a motion condemning Ms. Anderson and her views? Or what can be done to formally note that at the very least is a lack of judgment of these MPs that posed with her.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you, Minda. Thank you for all your work and, your tremendous work of you and the organization, the Federation of Filipino Canadians is really appreciated. And I agree completely with it's very important to combat anti-Asian racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism together, and that all groups should be working together on all of the different files and not have, only Jews on anti-Semitism and only Muslims on Islamophobia and only people of Asian origin on anti-Asian, and everybody has to work collaboratively. Look, I'm not a partisan guy. I mean, I'm sure most Liberal MPs would use this as an opportunity to condemn the Conservative MPs that you mentioned. Certainly, the views of Ms. Anderson and her party are deeply distressing. It's hard to believe that anybody that was meeting her for a lunch didn't know what she stood for. It's up to Mr. Poilievre to deal with his caucus, accordingly. What I think is more troubling is that he made the statement to Brian Lilly of the Toronto Sun, but didn't put it up on social media for any of his followers to see that. And tried to, he tried to have the people he wanted to hear that he said this hear it, and the people that he didn't want to see that he said this not see it. And that I think is problematic. And I think we have bad politics on all sides all the time. And I'd rather be seen as somebody constructively working with my Conservative and NDP colleagues on most issues, which I try to do. I don't think it's fair to say that these three MPs represent the entire Conservative caucus. They represent the three of them, and the three of them deserve to bear the brunt of what happens. And certainly their leader has a right to say what he thinks. But I'm not somebody that jumps on the partisan bandwagon to go yell and scream. The House would have every right to pass a motion. I don't think that passing a motion condemning individual members of Parliament serves anything more than partisan interest, really. So condemning Ms. Anderson in her views, that's a different question. I think certainly the House could, and probably somebody will, propose a motion to condemn Ms. Anderson in her views that will probably be adopted unanimously, because nobody would want to not do that. So I think that idea is likely to happen, but we'll see what happens next week when the House meets on Monday. Anyways, thanks for your question.
Thanks, Anthony. Thank you. Thank you, Minda, for your question. I know a lot of people read about Ms. Anderson's visit, were quite upset that she was in Canada at all, and clearly, members of Parliament meeting with her got amplified in the press and did get a lot of people to ask why they met with her in the first place. I'm going to go to Will Barkley for the next question, then we'll throw it open for a few minutes of open questions from the floor. Thank you. Will Barkley, please take the floor.
Hey, thank you so much, Mr. Rotrand. I'm sorry, Mr. Housefather. So the House Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security has called for urgent legislation as a means to combat ideologically motivated violent extremism. And online hate has also been identified as an urgent issue by various levels and sectors of government. In fact, the Brith annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents clearly shows a trend over the past 5 years that indicates that hate has firmly moved online. Can you maybe explain to us what ideologically motivated violent extremism is exactly, and how it differs from violent extremism that doesn't have, say, an ideological underpinning? And maybe you could also touch on how online hate ultimately crosses the boundary and becomes overtly violent in nature.
Sure. Well, again, I'm not on the Public Safety Committee, so I can't speak to their report or how they defined it. I'm not on that committee. I am one of the international co-chairs of the International Task Force to Combat Online Anti-Semitism, and I do sit on the Canadian Heritage Committee that will be reviewing the online harms bill that we will be putting out later this year. And what I can say is, as many organizations have aptly demonstrated, hate online often moves to the streets. People that become victims of the propagation of hate online often see themselves being attacked physically. And you see people who become ideologically motivated to hate by being trapped into groups online that move people from conspiracy theorists to actually believing that certain minority groups are the ones causing all of the ills in the world. And so The danger is that online harms don't just stay online. They move to increases in assaults, increases in physical threats, and even sometimes to murder. You've seen, for example, violent extremists attack the synagogues in Squirrel Hill near Pittsburgh, which is a suburb of Pittsburgh, in Poway, California, and somebody else hold people hostage in Colleyville, Texas. You've seen the mosque attack in Quebec City. You see that people who learn online that they're not alone in hating minority groups and become part of those communities often move their actions to much worse things than being just online. So we need the social media platforms to help us confront this. And where they won't act alone, and they've shown they will not enforce their own rules properly, we need to regulate them. And so what we need to see is social media platforms be transparent and disclose their algorithms. They claim that hate is not being sent to hate, but we all know that it is. In order to monetize the platforms, in order to make people stay on the platforms as long as possible, they send people to what they want to hear, which become echo chambers. We know that they don't properly enforce rules. When we report posts that clearly violate social media platform rules, they don't come down, sometimes for weeks or months, or sometimes never. And you need to remind them over and over again about your complaints. So we need reporting mechanisms that are followed up properly. We need them to apply their own rules, and if they don't, they should be fined. And we need the social media platforms to be very clear whether they allow hate on their platforms or they don't. There's certain hate that's illegal in Canada, right? Like hate speech is illegal. The attempt to incite people to genocide is illegal. Attempt to incite people to violence is illegal. But there's a lot of hate that's not illegal. They're just awful words. And those awful words have to have consequences. If most platforms say they don't allow that, but they still leave it up. If they're going to allow it on their platform, then they need to allow people to opt out of receiving it in their feeds. And they need to be fined if they don't use the opt-out message, if they're not doing the opt-out mechanism properly. But most platforms say they don't allow it at all. And those platforms have to be held accountable for not allowing it at all. And Britain has put forward an online harms bill that I think is very much the model that I would suggest Canada go in. And I look forward to reviewing that bill at the earliest opportunity before the Heritage Committee.
Thanks, Anthony. If I recall correctly, there was some sort of bill on online harms tabled in 2019. Correct, it died on the order paper when the 2019 election was called. I don't recall what was in there. Is that in the same sense of what you're talking about this evening?
Yeah, there's been consultations on an online harms bill. The initial bill was withdrawn. I don't think it was only because of the election. I think the bill was tabled and then withdrawn because of the fact that many groups had expressed concerns that it would intrude on freedom of speech to a greater extent than necessary. And so the government then said we were going to hold further consultations, and Canadian Heritage has held multiple consultations over the last year to look at other options of the way the bill could be worded. But I think we also need to remember that as a lot of people say, hate speech is not free speech. Hate speech often causes other people to lose their free speech. Because once you start being worried about saying something, because people will attack you and say, you know, you're a horrible Jew or a horrible Filipina or whatever on social media, then you may be worried about writing anything anymore because you don't want to be attacked. So we have to balance everything out. You should never censor free speech, but platforms are not government. Government is the one that needs to allow free speech. Social media platforms that are owned by private companies are not subject to the Bill of Rights in the United States or the Charter of Rights in Canada. They are allowed to decide what is allowed on their platforms or not. They publish rules. And those rules all tell us that you can't have hateful content on their platform. Yet they still allow it, and that's the problem.
Exactly. There's a necessity to have the platforms apply their terms of services, which do not happen hardly ever at all. I'm going to throw it open for a few minutes for open questions for people who didn't contact us before. If you wish to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will recognize you. Please don't be shy. Anthony's willing to answer a question in any field, not just on the area of language, but on broader issues as well. I don't see any volunteers at the moment, so I'm going to conclude the meeting with the following. This is the first in a series of town halls. I want to stress that B'nai Brith is a nonpartisan organization. We do not support any particular party. We advocate to all of them on behalf of the Jewish community. We advocate to all of them on behalf of our partner organizations. We cherish the support we receive from other religious and racial minorities, and we give the same support to those who are facing discrimination, hate, obstacles to their ability to prosper in Canada. We work not only with the government of Canada, but with all the provinces, the municipalities, and the school boards to make sure that our message is understood. And in such, these town halls are a way for the community to pass messages, seek clarifications from elected officials, or just to sensitize to the feelings of the community. We will be trying to do this in every region of the country, and we'll be approaching all the different political parties to assure that they have a voice in front of our audience. I appreciate Mr. Housefather's answers this evening, which were detailed, but also were an effort to build bipartisan support. I think that's extremely important, and we find that less and less in our political instances. When I was a city councillor, I did not necessarily see the people on the other side of the hall as an enemy, but people who had, strongly held views that weren't necessarily mine, but who were open to hearing the message that I had. And I think Parliament will work better if we can, often build that sort of bipartisan consensus on important issues of the day. Clearly, fighting hate is something I think almost everyone in Parliament is going to sign on to. So, Mr. Housefather, on behalf of B'nai Brith, Anthony, on behalf of B'nai Brith, I thank you for being with us this evening, for enlightening us on where we are with C13. Some of your information I found rather chilling, and there's certainly work to do. One thing that cannot happen is complacency. Those who have legitimate concern are going to have to be heard by their elected officials and alert others as well to how we might nip in the bud some of the worst impact of some of those amendments. Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. This meeting is concluded, and I once again thank all the participants for being with us, and those particularly who contacted us to ask for the right to be heard in question period. Good evening, everybody.
Bye-bye. Good evening.